The UK government have implemented a huge overhaul of the inheritance tax regime, resulting in some genuinely positive benefits for expatriates and their families. Watch on to find out more. In decades gone by, and unknown to a lot of expatriates, UK inheritance tax, or IHT, has always been based on something called your domicile of origin. For those of us born in the UK to a British father, we carry that domicile with us, even if we've lived abroad for many years. In fact, your state of domicile has always been something notoriously difficult to get rid of. So much so that any perceived connection to the UK upon your death, irrespective of where you were resident at the time, would have had HMRC circling around your assets for their pound of flesh, as it were. And this was the root cause of a tax trap that caught many families out, who presumed that their non-UK residency meant non-UK inheritance tax liability. Perhaps the most famous case being that of the actor Richard Burton, who lived outside the UK for many years and likely presumed he had no IHT exposure, only for his family to discover when he died that he was still deemed UK domicile, in part owing to his wish to be buried in Wales, with the Welsh flag draping his coffin. The case which HMRC ultimately won in the courts. Anyway, fast forward to 2025, and in a huge turn of events, the rules on inheritance tax have been changed from domicile to UK residency status. Now your IHT liability depends on whether or not you're deemed long-term UK resident upon your death, as well as where the assets are located. What does that mean? Well, if you've been non-UK resident for at least 10 out of the last 20 years when you die, your estate will no longer be subject to IHT. Fantastic, I hear you shout. But no, hold the horses. There's an important exemption, and that is your UK-based assets. Unfortunately, everything above the £325,000 nil rate band, if not being passed on to a spouse or civil partner, so your children for example, well, that value will continue to be liable to IHT irrespective of where you live. So that's any UK properties, residential or commercial, investments including ISAs, GIAs and onshore portfolio bonds, bank accounts, and perhaps surprisingly, UK pensions from 2027. So just to reiterate, if you've lived 10 years out of the last 20 outside the UK and are therefore classed as non-UK long-term resident under the new rules, your worldwide assets will no longer be subject to UK inheritance tax when you die. But all your UK-based assets will always be potentially exposed unless you do something about it. So overall, a very positive change. But what about those UK assets? We can take action now to mitigate the negative effect that this may have on our families in the future. So for your investments left in the UK, there could be a very strong case for liquidating and transferring those funds to a more appropriate investment vehicle outside the UK regime and therefore outside the scope of inheritance tax. And this approach could arguably be applied to UK property as well. But do keep in mind the potential for non-UK residents' capital gains tax. So in this case, a somewhat subjective decision, let's say. Furthermore, any unavoidable IHT liability should be planned for now with a funding strategy such as a universal life assurance policy, especially if you want to make sure your beneficiaries receive the full value of your UK estate. So what about UK pensions? Well, just a reminder that from 2027, all pensions in the UK will also be potentially subject to IHT for non-UK residents. What about transferring to an offshore pension such as a CUROPS? Well, the 25% overseas transfer charge has taken the shine off that one, although it could be argued that 25% now is better than 40% IHT further down the line if your sole objective with that pension is to pass it on to your children or other non-spousal beneficiaries. It's also important to remember that the rules around residency and UK inheritance tax remain complex. And as ever, the devil is in the detail. So if this is an area of concern, I would urge you to get in touch via the contact details in the description below, and we'll set up an initial consultation. So that's it for this video. I'm Pat MacDonald. I hope you found this information helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.